Welcome back to another edition of the Edge podcast. Publisher Brenden Slaughter here for BeaversEdge.com, joined by Beavers Edge writer Dylan Callaghan-Croley as we're breaking down Oregon State's 2024 recruiting class. The Beavers signed 10 new names, a little less than the 13 that we maybe expected going into the morning, but nevertheless, Trent Bray met the media. They talked about the 10 signees. Dylan, we're obviously going to dive into the class itself. There's a lot to get into, but just first impressions, I wanted to check in with you. How low did the class get? I think it was 3 or 4 at one point, maybe 5. And then number 2, just your thoughts on, credit to, Trent Bray and his staff for being able to actually get a reasonable and talented, signing class in before, just with the wake of everything that they were dealing with Jonathan Smith, essentially, plucking off recruits left and right from that class.
Right, yeah. I think the class got as low as 6, because they've picked up 7 commits, I think, here in the last couple of days. And I think that puts them at theoretically 13 total in this class now. 10, I believe, signed here on Wednesday. They have posted, a graphic on Twitter of the signees. They've, I believe, probably sent out a release already of the signings as well. Which probably tells you we're not expecting anything here in the immediate. Now, 4-star wide receiver, top 100 prospect Jordan Anderson, is expected to make a decision this week between San Diego State and Oregon State. So we'll see what he ultimately does there. That's going to be a very close one here come towards the finish. There's a couple other prospects out there that the Beavers are in on that could be making a decision here in the next 24 to 72 hours. They have until Friday to make decisions. If players don't make decisions before Friday, they'll have to wait until February to sign somewhere. They can make their commitments at any time, but to sign. Sorry, what was the second part of
I mean, Trent Bray's ability just to fill the class.
Yeah.
I mean, not fill the class. I mean, you and I have been breaking down the class daily, Dylan, and kind of getting into the guys. And, I have, and I'm sure you have too in situations. I've covered a Oregon State football season in 2017 where, Gary Anderson was let go. The interim staff was brought in. The interim staff offered a whole bunch of guys. And with hindsight, I can say a whole bunch of guys that were maybe space fillers, a whole bunch of guys that, were like, we have to add a guy just to add a guy. Trent Bray made a special point about that during his press conference today, saying they felt like they weren't backed into a corner. These were all still talented guys. Just kind of speak to that a little bit, reassure Beaver fans that while they lost a good number of recruits, these weren't like a step down in talent. Like, they still felt really good about these guys, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the best way to put it for these guys, or maybe guys, it's almost to a sense kind of like Moneyball in baseball. They looked at guys that maybe didn't have the highest values across the region, across the country, for whatever reason it may be. The talent level they're facing, maybe it's a size thing, maybe it's whatever it may be. There's some reason they were not as valued as high as other prospects. But you also look at a lot of these guys that they brought in the last 72 hours or so have been high production guys at their high schools. I mean, just what they've added. You look at running back Saladin Allah, I think is his name, out of Texas. Couldn't find any stats on him, but you look at that highlight tape, you can see why the Beavers liked him. He's physical. He has good size already. To
that point real quickly, Dylan. The Beavers, when we posted our notebook here on Beavers Edge a few minutes ago, they dropped some stats with him. He had 650 yards and 11 touchdowns as a senior. Just real quick on the running backs, to your point with that, we've seen and this has been kind of fascinating to me because you and I have covered it from the beginning. I'll start by saying this, no disrespect to any recruit specifically, but Dylan, the 2 running back commitments who flipped from Oregon State to Michigan State, again, just from what we've seen, the Beavers Edge community was not real high on those 2 commits. Flip the script a little bit. Trent Bray and his staff bring in 2 different guys. we've seen the conversation. There's probably not been a bigger conversation on Beavers Edge this week than those two running back commitments. And obviously we all have the same tape. We're all looking at the same things. And, Dylan and I look at it through a slightly different lens than a fan does, obviously. But it seems like they may actually like these two prospects better than Brenden Tullis and Mekhi Frazier.
Right. Yeah. And I think it is fair. You look at Brenden Tullis now to his not credit, but in his defense. Defense, he was banged up this season, couldn't really get it going this year. Played on a bad team. That's not. But yeah, the stats when he was on the field were not totally great. Mekhi Frazier, kind of a little bit of a question mark, just because this is a kid that Oregon State at the time, now Michigan State, recruited as a running back, but for I think it's Memorial High School, whatever high school it may have been that Mekhi Frazier did play at. He played mostly linebacker. He didn't play a ton of running back because they also had a four-star running back, Brian Jackson, who is signed with USC in the program. And they had a few other running backs, but he wasn't even the number 2 running back, though. He played mostly linebacker. Now, when we talked to his coach, Marcus Shivers, over the summer, he said he's, a team guy he'll play wherever needed. But at the same time, you're asking a kid to come into college, play a running back position in which he didn't play a ton his last year of high school. Now, some people are going to look at that as a benefit and say, hey, this is a guy who doesn't have a lot of mileage on his wheels. Others are going to say, how do you know he's going to be able to come in and, perform at a high enough level to play or be an impact player at this level? So, I mean, it's fair to say the stats were not there for those two. And you look at these two running backs for the Beavers in Ala and in
Cornell Hatcher, yeah.
Cornell Hatcher. I was looking for his stats here, but Cornell Hatcher rushed for 2,257 yards as a senior, and then, as we mentioned before with Ala, 650 yards, a lot of touchdowns as a senior. These are two guys who have been very productive over the last 2 years of high school football. Hatcher, 4,000 yards. He's now a third-generation Beaver. Ala with a combined 1,500 yards over the last 2 seasons. These are guys who have that production. Now, why weren't they more highly recruited? That can be due to various reasons. Ala did not exactly play the highest level of high school football in Texas. You can see that in his tape. It is very much a man against boys.
Yeah.
Hatcher, I'll have to look more deep into what was going on there, but with all these guys that Oregon State did take over the last few days, they all had pretty high production in their senior year of high school football, which I think is saying something. Yes, they may not be a highly recruited, but these are guys who showed up in their senior year and performed week in and week out. I mean, and I'm not calling them out by any manner, but I think perhaps the lowest production of any commitment over the last few days was Eugene or Sheldon, defensive end Will Haverland, who as defensive end had 3.5 sacks this year, 29 tackles. Not eye-popping numbers, nothing that you're gonna, be like, oh wow, that's a dominant season, but it's still quality numbers. He had 12.5 tackles for a loss as a junior as well. So I mean, he has a history of production, but I think, like you said, they're not just taking space fillers. They may not have been the highest recruited guys. That is very fair to say, but they're taking guys who have shown the ability to produce at a high level on a consistent basis. And yes, it may take a couple of these guys a little bit more time to develop, but once they get caught up in that development, they're going to be guys that they expect to step in and to be able to produce at quality levels.
Yeah, no doubt. And, last point on those running backs. I mean, you mentioned it, obviously, Ala. I think, getting a guy from Texas, you're going to take that if you're Oregon State. You're going to take a chance on a guy, and obviously only comes in as a 2-star. But again, Trent Bray mentioned him today. He's like, he was surprised that Ala wasn't more recruited. He's like, he is 6 foot, 200 pounds as a high school senior, right? He was particularly impressed. Hatcher, you mentioned third generation Beav. I think they could be getting a real steal with him from Centennial down there in Corona. I mean, we know California. I mean, just even go back to last year, this is different positions and everything. But, Dylan, tell me right now, would Aiden Childs have been a 5-star recruit if he was at St. John Bosco playing starting quarterback? Probably.
Probably, it is how it tends to go.
In the very least, I mean, he was per Rivals, I think the second or third transfer quarterback in this year's rankings. So, and he was a 3-star when he joined Oregon State, and came out of Downey, which wasn't particularly well known as like a football powerhouse.
And he did rise by the end to being a 4-star prospect, Rivals 250, all that. But yeah, when they found him, when they had him committed, he was still a relative unknown. He was a kid who his junior year of high school barely played because of an injury, and then really broke out that senior season for Downey. Now, notably, kind of like Wadala, playing in a very talent-rich area. Downey, California, located is a neighborhood in Los Angeles.
Right.
So, I mean, still playing elite talent. And yes, maybe Alo wasn't playing the highest level of Texas high school football, but it's still Texas high school football. And the lowest level of Texas high school football is still probably much better than the best level of some high school football across the country.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take any shots, but like I said, it's I would be curious to see like a lower level Texas team take on like a higher level like Oregon team, just for example. But nevertheless, let's go ahead and keep rolling. Obviously, Dylan and I just talked about the running backs. Let's stay local. Let's talk quarterback and Kalen Guttridge from my neighboring rival town, Dylan. Wilsonville. When I was at Sherwood, Sherwood was, when I went to high school, Sherwood was the 5A level. Wilsonville was our direct rival, and now Sherwood's at 6A, Wilsonville 5A. So not the highest class of competition in the state of Oregon, but nevertheless, a kid with good size, comes in at 6'3", but 185 pounds. Probably needs to put on a little bit of muscle, a little bit of weight.
Yeah.
I think this is definitely a like you said earlier, Moneyball. Maybe rolling the dice on his development in a couple years in the program. Like, this is not a kid they're expecting to come in and play as a true freshman, but maybe not even as
a redshirt freshman.
Right.
This is a kid that's going to take 2 years probably to develop at the least. Maybe when he's a redshirt sophomore, we start talking about him being able to make an impact on the field. I mean, and not to give away too much, but we know the Beavers are very active in the transfer portal, have a shot to land a couple transfer quarterbacks. Depending on what they land there, that could affect the Guttridge timeline as well. But what is Oregon State again and Guttridge? I mean, you look at it, I think the best way to put it is projectable. 6'4", 190 pounds, like you said. There's still plenty of weight to put in on that frame, I should say. At 6'3", 6'4", he should be able to get up to the 220-pound mark at some point here. So, I mean, we're talking about 35, 40 pounds over the next couple of years. But beyond that, I mean, a proven winner, 41-5 during his 4 seasons at Wilsonville, led them to a 5A state championship this past season, has a big arm, is accurate, 64.7% completion percentage this past season, 53 touchdowns, nearly 3,500 yards. Again, production. This is a kid who was very productive for Wilsonville as a starting quarterback, is a proven winner, and has shown the ability to play against some pretty high talent. It's on Texas high school football, like we were just saying, but it's still there's some pretty damn good talent still in Oregon, especially at the 5A level, and he's performed at every step of the way. When you're in a situation like Oregon State, when you have the transfer portal where you're going to need to take some quarterbacks anyway, you have room to take a quarterback like this who is projectable, who is a little bit of a gamble. If everything goes well, there's a quarterback who definitely can develop into a really nice quarterback for the Beavers. And we'll see how that goes, but patience will be required. This is going to be a 2, maybe even 3-year process for the Wilsonville native.
For sure. And it reminds me a little bit of it was before you joined us, Dylan, but a couple years ago when the Beavers took Sam Vidlak, was a local high school prospect, came out of Hidden Valley, which is, pretty small school down in Southern Oregon. I think that was 3 or 4A competition. And, obviously didn't work out for him. He ended up transferring and doing some different things. But I said at the time, and I still like it, I love that Oregon State, is recruiting in-state quarterbacks. I know it is rare to find a, Power Five level, multi-year starting quarterback at the Oregon level. But again, when one of your best quarterbacks in school history and Derek Anderson is from right up the road in Scappoose, I do think you occasionally have to kick the tires on the local guys. And, I think Trent Bray talked about that a little bit today. And, I mentioned it to Dylan, just how he, talked about wanting to continue having a good, strong presence of Oregonians. Jake Cookus has pretty much primarily been the in-state recruiter. Dylan and I haven't heard a whole lot on Mr. Cookus and what his long-term plans are, but at this point, it's leaning like he's probably going to be back, for the Beavers, given that they haven't, announced. They've announced pretty much every other hire for the most part, so that's something to keep an eye on too here in the coming days. But yeah, definitely agree on all fronts there with what he's going to bring under center. And I think, it's always worth it to, I think, kick the tires on a guy that put up good stats, good numbers, and of course is local and probably has a burning fire to play for, a program like Oregon State or Oregon or any of his local schools. Moving over to the offense.
I would add, and just to build off what you said about taking local kids, taking Oregonians, and going back to Allah, you can say the same thing about taking Allah. That keeps the Beavers active in the state of Texas. That keeps them in a talent-rich area, especially in that Houston area. Plenty of talent down in that area, so keeping that pipeline alive is important. But with the Oregonians, I mean, and yeah, it's going to be tough with the situation and when going up against teams like Oregon, especially for in-state kids. But it feels, too often that for those in-state kids anymore, that it is, they are likely going to Oregon or out of state. They're very rarely, it seems to be, really looking at the Beavers now that and Sue Sano in the 2026 class has been taking a deep, long look at the Beavers so far. That's a good start. But I think now you don't want to do it and you don't want to stretch yourself to the point that the kid's a huge question mark. But taking some of these, even if they're a little lower ranked kids, keeping that in-state presence, I think is important for the Beavers going forward. Because when one of these schools does produce that rare, high 4-star, 5-star talent, you give yourself a fighting chance in that recruitment at least. Yes, it's not going to be easy to recruit that type of talent going forward, but plenty of other programs in the country at similar level as Oregon State's going to be has shown the ability to recruit that type of talent, and there's no reason the Beavers cannot do the same, especially considering, at least when I look at it, I know a lot of people have, a disappointed view of how things are going for Oregon State, but I think wherever Oregon State does end up, they have a chance to still be a very dominant program in that whatever conference division of football, because who knows what college football is going to look like in 5 years. Wherever Oregon State ends up, I think they're going to have a chance to be amongst the premier programs in their level. So, and I think that's going to help them on the recruiting trail going forward as well. So I think taking guys like Gutteridge is important for that aspect as well.
Sure. And when you've got proof in the pudding, I mean, just to add a little bit more context to that, and we'll get to the defense here shortly, but I think of a guy like Corey Stover, who is probably going to be, he played a lot of snaps this year at outside linebacker, could be an outside linebacker starter last year or next year. Came from Coos Bay, and if I'm not mistaken, was a 2-star recruit and a multi-year project. Same kind of a thing where it's like, this guy's really tall but really light and needs to add on some weight, really get into the program. And, I just think when you've got guys or even, someone who like Katano Ladapo's, I believe it was his just overall defensive PFF grade was amongst the top 25 in the country, Dylan. He was a walk-on from Central Catholic when he started his Oregon State career. So I do think that, when Oregon State has proof of, hey, you come here, you invest in our player development program, you will see the benefits, by the end. So I think that's still a good pitch they can do for some of those guys that are maybe under the radar, maybe get lost in the shuffle with the portal and everything and all that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I guess last thing, then we can move on. But I think going forward, Oregon State absolutely still is a developmental program first and foremost, because most schools, most schools, no matter who you are, even I cover schools like Penn State, Minnesota, a little bit of Michigan State. Those schools aren't bringing in 5-star talent every year. They rarely do. They bring in some high 4-stars, some mid-level 4-stars, and so on and so forth. Yes,
Sure.
But at the end of the day, very few schools recruit at the insane levels that everybody would like to recruit.
Yeah, we're not Georgia. We're not all
right.
Georgia out here.
Right. Right. And for Oregon State, the foundation of their program is always going to be these mid 3-stars who they develop into 4-star, 5-star players. Sure. But with that, I think you're going to see also going forward a lot of transfer portal.
Right.
We've seen it last year. We're going to see it this year. The Beavers are an opportunity for those players that maybe got lost in the shuffle at their past school.
Right.
A Malik Murphy, for example. Malik Murphy is a really good quarterback, really high potential. Could be a really fun quarterback wherever he lands. But at Texas, he got stuck behind Quinn Ewers and then Arch Manning.
Sure.
And Oregon State is a potential option for him. You looked at, DJU, a guy who didn't meet expectations at Clemson, comes to Oregon State, sure, raises his stock, and now he may end up going to play with a team that should have made the college football playoffs this year.
Yeah.
And yes, they're going to lose guys to transfer portal as well, probably. But I think you're going to see a foundation, maybe 60, 70% of those mid-level guys. Then you're going to see about 30, 25, 35% transfer portal. And then you're going to hope that you can get some 4-star, high 3-star, 4-star right, prospects every couple years that can be that game changer type talent. And all it really takes is one of those players to really make a difference. And I think that's probably going to be the formula for Oregon State going forward. You could probably, change the numbers around a little bit, but I think that's what you're ultimately going to see going forward. But I guess we should get into the rest of this class.
We could definitely keep rolling. No, you're good. You're good. Like I said, a lot to break down. And, again, thanks for joining us here on the Edge podcast. Brenden Slaughter, Dylan Callaghan-Croley here. Let's move to the offensive line, Dylan. Let's talk Dylan Sikorsky first before we get into Adam Hawks. I like both these guys, but I want to talk first about Sikorsky. Checks in at 6'4", 325 with today's updated height weight.
The big boy.
Tell me why tell Beaver fans rather, because he's the last guy. He is the one lone recruit from Jim Michalczik who did not go to Michigan State or elsewhere. Is that because he's the least desirable, or is that just because who he is? And I'm going to throw in real quick as well, Dylan. He might be my favorite recruit in the class based on some of the things Oregon State released to us. Dylan, he wants to be a cattle rancher after his playing career and camping, hiking, and fishing in his spare time. I'm like, okay, this guy sounds very Oregon State. So just give me your thoughts on that, why he was not like Rustin Young or Peyton Stewart, another Washingtonian, right? Peyton Stewart's from Kelso. That's an hour up the road from me. So was it Sikorsky wanting to stay local? Was he sold by Devan's brief vision, do you think? Combination of both, or just something else entirely, like wanting to stay firm to his original commitment?
I think with Sikorsky, I think a lot of it comes down to where you're going to be comfortable the most. And, like you said, he sounds like an Oregon State player based off his answers, loving the camp. He loves the campus and the atmosphere of Corvallis. And now, don't get me wrong, East Lansing, I've heard is a very nice campus, and I'm not sure if Michigan State showed interest in them once the coaching staff change or whatever it may be. But I mean, this is a kid who was a really high-end offensive tackle prospect out of Sumner.
Sure.
A quality one, to say the least. Has elite size already at 6'5", 6'4", 325. This is a kid who is almost, college ready from a
Right.
physicality standpoint. He'll probably need to. I wouldn't be surprised if he actually loses a little bit of weight before he sees the field. Maybe turns some of that 325 into 315 with a little bit more
Sure.
muscle than body fat. But I think it comes back to being comfortable, and I think because I'm not sure he was necessarily a guy who was when everything happened was 100%. Maybe he was. I didn't get talked to too much, but I'm sure like every recruit did. He had some question marks after Jonathan Smith
Sure.
left, but I think Kyle Devan is a high, a very well respected offensive line coach, high
Sure.
relationship guy. I've heard a lot of good things about him already. I think that helped, but I think just being comfortable where you're going to be for the next 4 years, despite whoever the coaching staff may be, is big for him. And he had other options, that's for sure. But yeah, that's a good question of why he ultimately chose to stay.
It'll be something for us to definitely, eventually, either before he ultimately signs and lands talking to him, or after he eventually signs and lands. And that's just curious because, Dylan, at one point, I think Oregon State had 5 or 6 offensive line commits. It was a big class, and
Yeah,
it was whittled. It was
a really nice class,
and it was
unfortunately.
whittled down to Sikorsky. So I don't know. There's an interesting question for me there, but nevertheless, a 4-year starter. Just again, like I said, a guy that looks like he lives and breathes Oregon State. Speaking on the offensive line too, let's go ahead and move over to Adam Hawks. This is a guy who definitely was on Kyle Devan's radar. I would say probably when he was the offensive line coach at Colorado, coming out of Harriman, Utah. Again, 6'5", 280, probably going to project into more of a tackle, I would say. But again, Trent Bray talked about how this guy's still growing, and that's kind of interesting. So I think he's, again, going back to our kind of reoccurring theme, more of a developmental piece. But yet again, another guy, like, I'll take 6'5", 280, for a guy that is only a 2-star coming out of high school. And again, we say stars. I know that those listening are like, probably don't want to hear about stars, and we only say it as a reference tool. That's not like Dylan and I have just gave our whole spiel about why we think Oregon State can develop guys into better players, but we use it as a reference tool. And yeah, for the most part, Dylan, I think when you consider that they weren't able to hang on to anybody but Sikorsky, and then you figure in they're going to add in Van Wells and Gerard Lichtenhand or Christian Lichtenhand from Colorado, 2 guys who I would expect to start. This is fine. Like, you've seen it as well too. Well, it remains to be seen if anybody else looks to leave. But Dylan, Jim Mahalchuk left the cupboard very full as far as offensive line depth and talent in Corvallis. I mean, you look at the group they're putting together for the bowl game, and it's like, hey, that still could be a pretty good starting 5, because I think they've had some really good guys in the pipeline. I mean, you think back to even, last couple of years, like Nathan Elu, Luka Vincic. I mean, guys that have already started to work their way in. So I think Adam Hawks and Dylan Sikorsky fit in really well.
No, absolutely. And Hawks, I mean, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but I mean, taking some 2-star kids, and yes, we're using these as a reference.
Yeah.
Stars are not, an absolute end all be all. Kids get missed, all the time. It happens. They're a good reference tool. They're good for supplement your information, but they're not an end all be all. But I mean, it's not like Oregon State is just taking 2-star prospects this cycle because they'd had to. The Beavers have always, had some 2-star prospects here and there, and a couple of them have developed into really nice players. And I think there's potential for Hawks to develop into a nice player. 6'6", 6'5", 280, still has plenty of room to grow. Has time to develop under Kyle Devan with how full that cupboard is, like you said. And you're looking at a guy who has the pedigree to be a college football player. His dad played at Missouri. His grandfather played at Utah. Now he's the first offensive lineman. Both of them were linebackers, but still has the pedigree to play college football. And I think has a chance to develop into a nice piece for Oregon State. We'll see how that goes. Also competes in discus and shot put and track and field. Shows good strength on film. I think there's a lot to like about him. It just gonna be one of those guys where it takes a little bit further in more development before he sees film.
Sure. And, moving along to the outside linebackers, we mentioned Will Haverland a little bit earlier. Just a couple things that I have. Again, Sheldon High School, tremendous program outside of Eugene. I like guys from Sheldon. It's a very competitive program. Dylan mentioned the stats. I think, Trent Bray kind of, I look at Will Haverland and I say is, very John McCartan-like mold, where it's like this guy could grow into a John McCartan in a couple of years, maybe even a Corey Stover type. Again, like you said, not a ton of production, 29 tackles, 3.5 sacks. But again, a guy that, from what we've heard, really, he was like, this is real proof in the pudding, Dylan. If you can be a Beaver fan growing up in Eugene and going to Sheldon High School, I think you're already pretty tough. So, again, him saying that he's been a fan since he was a kid, I'm sure this was a dream thing for him. And he's probably going to be one of those guys who works extremely hard. And we'll see we'll kind of see what happens. But Trent Bray talked about again today, just another guy with, oozing potential. And then the second outside linebacker as well, Shamar Makel coming in from Miramar, Florida. What do you know about him, Dylan? He was a bit of a surprise this morning. But nevertheless, Trent Bray seemed to like what they heard from this, or what they knew from this guy. And you go back to that production as a senior. It seems to be the recurring theme here.
Yeah, and this was a guy that popped up on the radar last week. John Garcia dropped that on our boards. We appreciate that from John. Former Indiana commit, so this kid was committed to play in one of the best conferences in the country. And he had a pretty quality offer list to go along with that as well. But that production, 80 tackles as a senior, 36 tackles for a loss, 26.5 sacks. I think that's in his career, not in his senior season alone. But productive throughout his high school career in Florida, playing against some elite talent. And like I said, with Texas, this helps keep the Beavers in the state of Florida where, it's going to be tough to get kids to come cross country. But if you can still keep a little bit of a foothold in Florida, you're going to be fine. Because, a lot of players in Florida go overlooked. And I think
there's just so many.
Yeah, exactly. And he may be one of those guys. We have him ranked as the 91st best player in Florida. This is a kid who was committed to a Big Ten school, had 80 tackles as a senior, highly productive. And he's barely a top 100 prospect in the state. Tells you all you need to know about the talent in Florida.
Yes.
Rivals rate of 5.7. That's a pretty good rating to have. So I really like this pickup for the Beavers. And we'll see how he goes. I think he can turn into quite the pass rusher for them down the road.
Yeah. Let's talk about the two inside linebackers. Dexter Foster, starting with him, was listed as an outside linebacker in, as his recruiting profile goes. The Beavers seem to see him more as an inside linebacker. 6'3", 210. Given the guys that got playing inside linebacker, he's probably another guy that is going to need to put on some weight and kind of work into it. But again, like I said earlier, Central Catholic, went there to get noticed in his senior year. And I really like what, having another guy in Central Catholic, Katana Ladapo was one of my favorite players this last year. I think that program does a great job of preparing guys for the next level. So I like him. And then Gyrese Goodman, obviously coming from JUCO. Dylan, this is a guy who I imagine they could have compete for a starting job right away, given, just the loss as an inside linebacker this year. And, he's probably a little bit more instant impact than obviously Foster is. But I like these two inside linebackers. They fit the mold of, Trent Bray, the 6'2", 6'3", 200 and some change, being able to play physical over the middle.
Yeah, I think you put it really well there. I'm going to be interested to see how Foster kind of fits at inside linebacker. That's a pretty big inside linebacker, but I think you pretty you put it pretty well there. But I think what stands out about him, maybe this is why they like him there, is that he's a high football IQ guy. He really has good reading reaction skills at linebacker. Good athlete. So perhaps a guy they think could play sideline to sideline and be a leader of that defense in the middle there.
And then your thoughts on Goodman, obviously.
Goodman, yeah.
Yeah, the JUCO guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bit of a surprise, too, this morning.
And that huge commitment. I mean, you just looking at the offers alone, Baylor, Illinois, Liberty, Marshall, West Virginia among his offers. Those are nothing to scoff at. Highly productive for Garden City, 59 tackles, 2.5 sacks, 2 forced fumbles in 11 games. Somebody who's going to be able to step in right away for the Beavers next year. Maybe not be a starter, but be a rotational linebacker and play quite a bit for them.
And then closing it out, Dylan, maybe just based on what I can remember, there might not be a guy that you had more of an in-depth interview with than Exodus Ayers when you talked to him way back when he committed. And obviously you were on top of, he's obviously been listed as a wide receiver, played a lot of positions. You knew right away he was going to be a defensive back for the Beavers. Wrote some real good, in-depth stories on him. Make sure to check that out at BeaversEdge.com. 6'1", 185. Probably going to need some time. But what do you like about him to kind of close out the podcast? Versatility, but I think they must like the 6'1" size, particularly to play corner.
I wouldn't be surprised if he does play next year a little bit. I'm not saying start, but I think if he,
you think he's like a pick, he's someone that you could see figuring out of this class, figuring in sooner than later.
Yes, absolutely. If it's not next year, absolutely in 2025. 6'1", 185. He doesn't have to add too much weight. He shows pretty good, coverage skills, both man and zone defenses. He has great ball skills, very good athlete. He is somebody I can absolutely see playing sooner than most of the 2024 guys that Oregon State has committed. He's just not playing the greatest talent in New Hampshire, but he on tape looks quite advanced for than most cornerbacks. And this could be one of those guys that turns out to be quite the steal. Now we'll see how that development goes going forward. I mean, they lost obviously both guys back there on the coaching staff, so we'll see what happens. But I think he is definitely a guy to keep a very close eye on over the next 2 years.
Do you think he would have decommitted if Anthony Perkins didn't stay on? Because obviously we saw this is their one DB signee, but like you mentioned, Oregon State, bit of a unique situation. Like there weren't too many schools that had a secondary coach and a cornerbacks coach. So I'm curious your thoughts. Do you think, because Blue was, one of the first on the plane with Jonathan, do you think Perkins staying and being the DB, secondary coach moving forward, was that a part of it, you think?
Absolutely. Having that familiarity on staff is going to be huge for him. And I'm sure if Perkins, would have followed Jonathan Smith to Michigan State, he would have, been offered by Michigan State, and who knows what would have happened from there. But having that familiarity on staff, absolutely, I think he played a big part in Ayers being a Beaver now. And I think this is a prospect that is going to turn out to be a really nice steal for the Beavers. And I think that's all I got on him.
Yeah, like I said before, obviously just reading all your stuff, there was very few prospects that you got to talk to quite as much as Exodus. So I'm excited to see, what he can do. And I can just tell, listening that you think he's going to be someone that the Beavers be really happy to have. And, Dylan, I'm really happy to have you, man, because we were able to break down this entire recruiting class. And, want to give a big thanks to everyone for checking out this edition of the Edge podcast. Make sure to stay locked. Dylan and I are going to be wired into the transfer portal, any other developments that are going on with the Beavs. So, again, make sure to stay locked to BeaversEdge.com. For Dylan Callaghan-Croley, I'm Brenden Slaughter, signing off on this edition of the Edge podcast.